Okay, how's it going? Sorry, I was editing the agenda to add me and I wasn't even looking at the Zoom.
Morning, good evening.
Hey folks,
How's life?
very, very warm.
Nice. All right. It's that time of year.
Mm.
Still no AC for you, Benji.
Still, you can tell by the shine, can you?
I'm telling you, like, it's the best thing. Like,
Oh
I
yeah.
was, I had, like, do you remember when I went to, what was it? I think it was your first graphical London after a long break. You know, when me and Michael flew over, where I
Yeah.
had, the dizziness and so on.
Mm.
Things. In the meantime, I'm convinced this had to do with me working in the attic and it's just was way too hot for way too long. And my body could never really, recover
Recover.
from, yeah.
Could be. Pascal, you're not on the agenda.
I'm not, no.
Well, I'll allow you to address that. In the meantime, I'll get the meeting started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the August Golden Path Working Group meeting. So by being here, we have agreed to the specification membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct. We are aware that the meetings are recorded, they're published to YouTube, and that we use large language models and AI summary tools with them. We'll start with a quick introduction of attendees, starting with me and then going to Matt. So hello, everyone. I'm Benji from Graphart.
Hi, I'm Matt from Meta.
I'm Gerald from Apollo.
And I'm Pascal from Chilikum.
Um,
I'll check the agenda.
All right, thank you very much. As you know, the meeting notes are often taken by the AI, but if you think there's anything that the AI is not going to capture well, please do contribute to the live notes doc that is linked from the agenda. We actually have nothing on our agenda for this week, so it is an open discussion, but you're all here, so I'm sure you must have things that you're interested to talk about. So without further ado, who's got topics?
Great. We figured graphical out.
I am potentially trying to snipe a coworker into the meeting. So,
Awesome. Well, I'll let you continue doing that, Matt. Meantime, I'll say on my list of things to do, um, I have had interest from people that wanted to help by doing an analysis of the various documents that their platforms process. So, one of the things that we'd like to do as part of the Golden Path is make recommendations for various of the settings that we're proposing. So we're proposing things like, depth limits, list depth limits, um, field alias limits, document size limits, document token count limits, all the different things. So essentially, we need to figure out what things we might want to limit on, and then write a very simple, very easy to audit script that should basically have maybe GraphQL as a dependency and nothing else. So I propose that we just do it in JavaScript using the reference implementation, which obviously we should all trust. And then essentially, yeah, just allow this to then run across a corpus, maybe parallel processing across a corpus of documents and gather statistics from them, which we can then report back. So I'd love to know if there's any non-obvious things that you found to be important. For example, the difference between tokens and non-comment tokens. That's significant, it turns out, and other such things like that. please let me know, like, what limits do you have? What things do we want to know? Should we have limits on the number of arguments per field? Should we have limits on the number of abstract types that you can spread within a fragment? Should we have limits on the depth of fragments that are all occurring essentially nested in the same selection set? Because
Well, one thing that comes to mind is type explosion, right? So what's that again? Possibility of the set of all types can lead to the set of all possible types can become huge. If you have generic interfaces, like best practices suggest to have the node interface. Wherever you have a node interface, the potential types for this specific selection set become quite large. But that's something that we can't really limit anyway, right? So it doesn't make sense to this specific problem, now that I think about it, is not solvable because it doesn't matter how many fragments you spread in. It can literally just be one, right?
yeah, it's an interesting one. It depends whether you're using an interface to signal something or to query something, because they can be used for both, right? So you can say, like, this thing is searchable, and like, yeah, sure, it implements a common interface, but maybe you have like search users and search posts and search comments or whatever as separate entries, and you don't actually use the interface. So there can be situations like that. For node, like, yeah, you tend to have a node field. I think, though, Matt can correct me if I'm wrong, that's not really such an encouraged practice these days. And we do prefer to have more of like a lookup system. So maybe for this, that would be more of a discourage query points that leverage types that have, say, more than X hundred matches, or match more than, say, I don't know, 50% of the types in the schema or something, whatever makes sense there. But like node is a really good example. When you don't have the node field, it's a really good example of a marker interface. It's used to indicate that this type implements the interface, and you can rely on that for normalized caching, but without giving you something that you should necessarily be spreading on. And one of the interesting things in GraphQL is you can enable like nonsensical parts of the tree. So if you query a user, for example, you can say ... on that user, and then you can say ... on node, because user implements node, and then you can say ... on post inside of that, and that will never match. But it's still like a thing you're allowed to do, because at each layer it only remembers the one parent. So maybe it can be factored into linting as well to prevent that kind of thing. This wasn't what I was seeking, but it is still like a valuable point, and maybe one worth having some kind of entry in the golden path.
I think maybe more with what you're thinking. There's one of the things that we actually do is limiting the size of lists and paginations. So how large can your pagination window be in any given request? Don't let people request 1 million items. And that seems like something we probably could either statically enforce, or like an analysis of your document. Is the analysis meant to be purely static, or like purely at document creation time, or is it like linking that document to its actual usage?
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, like, what do you do for pagination limits there? Because there's multiple ways. like a really good, quite secure way of doing it is to put the pagination limit in the document as a hard-coded value and then use trusted documents. Like
that's
that
true.
basically fixes it. But then you can have runtime ones, but you can also, because the information's available in the document itself, even if you're using a variable, you then can have runtime validation. So the GraphQL spec at the moment specifies validation as a thing that is true of the document independent of the variables. But you can then introduce an additional phase, which is like run more validation rules that need the variables to rule things out. And that's often where like complexity limits and things like that come in, because they need to know what the variables are to know how things scale. So specifying something along those lines would also be good. Did I gather from you just then, Matt, from a nod, that you tend to do it hard-coded?
Well, we don't hard code the value, but we do have basically, depending on the system, have it either in the schema like, hey, this argument has a max, like you should not be requesting more than X number in this argument, like the maximum integer is X, or at the query variable having an annotation that like, hey, the trusted document will just shut down if you request more than X.
Pascal, you have your hand raised.
Yes. So we have static max. So we have you can configure it per field, but we have a global max on page size. We also have complexity, and that's a bit the thing which I wonder if this is something that we should include in the Golden Path recommendation, because technically page size is irrelevant if your complexity is right, because if you have a penalty on the page size that you request for complexity, it should fail. But this leaves the other questions open for when your window that you request is more difficult, I guess, if you like have a from to thing. It's harder to standardize. But anyway, there's a complexity thing, or is this just a static number thing, or is it both?
So I think we need both. One of the major issues with a complexity system is essentially that you can't really update it once you've shipped it. Like if you then go, actually, this field's really expensive, and you update its score from like 1 to 5, now you might be invalidating queries that already existed. And that's a really big issue.
Why you need tooling for your graphical server?
But like if you
They'll tell you that you
do
now break the client. So
I mean, that's a good point. Yeah. And again, if it takes the runtime variables into account for the complexity, you don't necessarily know what those values are going to be until runtime as well. So you might be invalidating those without realizing, unless, of course, you're logging your variables alongside your documents. But I wouldn't recommend that for various safety reasons. But pagination limits are much more straightforward. They're much more like maximum 100 across all fields, unless there's an override, in which case X, Y, and Z. And that kind of thing, I think, is more. It's also a lot more understandable to people. Like it's very weird for someone if they like have a query that works and then they spread a new fragment inside of it and suddenly they can't use that query anymore. That's a lot harder to understand exactly why it is, and then do I need to go to another part of my application and decrease the window that I'm rendering so that I can add a fragment over here? That said, when I've implemented the query complexity limits on some of my client projects, the numbers that come out of the query complexity estimates are humongous. Even though the queries aren't always the most complex, because often it's The complexity is like, what's the worst case scenario? And that's rarely the case with the actual user data. So I think, yes, we would like to specify some kind of complexity. And as you well know, the IBM spec on this is actually reasonably good. But it's not the
Why do
easiest
we
thing
have
to do.
Why does it have to be a specification in the Golden Path? Why can the Golden Path not just say that there should be some kind of static and maybe runtime complexity analysis without specifying it must be IBM cost specification?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And generally, we lean towards you can choose which path you want to go down. But this is one of those ones that spans multiple areas, right? The complexity limits are enforced by the server, but they are relevant to the client. So if you have some linting tool that looks at your GraphQL queries and says, are these going to be valid against your server? You can run the validation rules, sure. But if you want to do like complexity limits on the client side, you need to know what the complexity rules are. So it's beneficial for the ecosystem if there is a shared standard. You don't have to implement it. You can implement a different one. As always with the Golden Path, it's just like, here's what your default should be. But if we have like one standardized one that is in use, then now your tools can pull that down, your client can pull that down, and you're going to know ahead of time whether these documents are going to be invalid or not, which is much harder to do if you don't know what that system is.
I just agreed.
Hello, Mark. Welcome. So are there any like other key things that we should be thinking about here? I mean, there's so many different things that we could limit on, but are there key things that we found to be problematic, specifically when it comes to, so I'm talking primarily about this script that we can run against GraphQL documents and gather statistics from them. So what things do we want as an output of that? I feel like this is going to be something that we ask people to do once. So we kind of need to know what all of the questions are going to be up front and ask them and then get the results. So I'd rather like come up with as many different things that might be useful as possible.
If we can get the output, maybe this is actually more of a question of like, what should the output format of said script be so that we can evolve it, and like if you run it once on your trusted documents and then later things are added to it, it's fine. The old ones are just missing those bits of analysis, unless you rerun it against all your old ones.
Yeah, absolutely. So the plan with this script at the moment really is to inspire what the defaults for the Golden Path kind of for everyone should be. So I'm kind of hoping that like Apollo will run it against their query corpus, that like Hot Chocolate will run it against their query corpus, that the guild will run it against theirs. Like this should be like fully anonymous, right? Because it's just telling you number of selection sets, number of, arguments, that kind of thing. But ideally, we want to get out of that. Like, what's the 95th percentile for this kind of stuff? Let's set that as a reasonable top limit kind of thing. And then maybe, hey, we've decided to set the limits here. Here's how you can scan over your documents to see which ones fail it. And then maybe come back to us with like, is it reasonable that those fail? Or should we be recommending different defaults? But yeah, I think this can be useful for your own thing. Like this, that's actually a really good point. Like if you want to adopt the Golden Path and you already have 10 years worth of GraphQL queries, run this script and it will tell you what to set the various settings to that should work with your existing corpus. Like that's actually really cool and a really nice idea. But right now, I care about figuring out what the limits should be as kind of global defaults for everyone.
is there like an implied standard action item you should take if you hit one of those limits beyond shard into a separate operation? Like what is the guidance associated with that limit?
What do you think it should be, Mark?
Well, if you have a large page, a very large page, and you need all those fields, then you simply do need all those fields. I guess the cases of the cases of where I've seen like super big documents are where they have been compiled, like a compile step has built that operation, and the document itself, I suppose, one on the server would go through like the normalization, and if we ran that sort of on the client side, maybe there'd be some benefit there of sort of like normalizing and minifying the operation, and maybe that would get you under the threshold. So maybe that's some kind of like standard guidance as well. But even assuming you've done all that and you're still way over the limit, we have schema authors writing very like granular bits of schema, especially in the SDY space. To be honest, that's the specifics of where I'm thinking of where I see this the most. And I have an answer to that, but that's a much larger answer. That's something, Benji, that we've been chatting about there with structs. But fundamentally, the reason I asked the question is because I could see someone saying, look, I fundamentally just have a very big page. I therefore have a very big document. I suppose my guidance there would be towards like progressive loading of the like even high guidance than GraphQL, like looking at how the web page or the mobile app loads as a whole. And rather than loading in everything in one big document, the user can only see so much at once. And so, split like normal perf guidance applies, right? Above the fold and below the fold queries, like that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess maybe that's maybe that's the answer to the question, right?
Well, you've touched on a number of interesting ideas there. One of them that I would challenge is the breaking it up thing. Matt's done a great talk on the async directive, for example, which is like defer, but even more. I like that. But if you need this data to render the page, we have incremental delivery to render the bits as they are ready. So we can leverage that already. And I don't think that if you need all of that to render your current web page, you need all of that. And splitting it up and doing progressive loading is kind of like it's cheating, it's fake, right? It essentially, you need all that data. Breaking it up into more requests actually means the server has to do more work, not less. It's just doing it over more time. It's doing it in parallel more, right? Because you have additional like HTTP parsing and stuff. So I would tend to avoid that and tend to encourage incremental delivery, which is less from the total cost of the document point of view and more from the giving the user a nicer experience of like rendering the data as it's ready. But I think one thing here is to decide like where these limits are needed. So query complexity limits, I don't think you would use with a system. No, that's not accurate. Query complexity limits, I wouldn't particularly enforce on a system where you're using trusted documents, where you have a document allow list. I would enforce it typically on the client side of that as like a build artifact, as like a lint rule, like, hey, these queries are really expensive. Maybe you should go revisit them. Did you forget your pagination arguments? Did you accidentally merge in too many fragments? Like, here's some guidance that might be useful to you to improve the product. But by trusting that document, you're saying, I accept its complexity value. I don't care what it is, like I accept it. This, again, may or may not be the case. It depends how you do trusted documents. If you do trusted documents where you accept like pagination limits as variables, then you can still like feed in like 10 billion of these, please, and you get a problem. So you still need sensible limits within it. If you're hard coding the limits and like being very strict with how you define variables, it can be okay. If you have something that can't use trusted documents, then I think you're not tending to think in terms of like, I need all this stuff for one page, because you're actually typically serving your API to someone else, and it's like their problem then, and maybe they have to break it up. Matt.
So I don't know exactly how query complexity typically works. Does it include, and this also gets to, this is like one hop away from Mark's point. Does it typically include, like, if I have a union and I'm spreading many different fragments, like if I spread 100 fragments under a union and each of them are like on a different type? Does query complexity typically take the most expensive one of those fragments or the sum of the fragments? Because in that case, like, this results in very different, like, what I would actually recommend for Golden Path.
The most expensive path that can be
Okay.
taken.
Okay, that's good. Because actually, right, it's actually good to have a complex document with like many different options. It's better to have that in one document if you can, in fact, end up rendering one of, or like an instance of everything. So, okay, that makes sense.
I think your question's a really good one, though, Mark. Essentially, like, when something fails this, what do we do? So for pagination limits, I think it's quite explicit, right? If you say the limit's 100 and someone asks for 250, sorry, that's not allowed. Ask for 100. That's your limit. And do something like Matt suggests, where you can like indicate for each argument or for each variable in the document what those limits are, so that you know what they are. Integrate it into the error. Easy to solve. But when it comes to query complexity, things are much less obvious. Like, if you just say, sorry, the complexity of this document is 2.8 million and our limit is 1 million, it's like, okay, great. How do I fix this? Do I select one less fragment? Do I reduce my pagination limits on a few places? Do I remove a filter? Like, what's the solution to this? And I think it's a lot less clear. I think in general, query complexity as a like a cost directive style of thing, where you actually say this field is more expensive than this field, I think that has a whole bunch of like ways of going wrong or just being really hard to work with. On the other hand, the much more like explicit but rudimentary limits are much easier to follow. Like, maximum number of field selections that you're allowed to do in a selection set is 50. Let's see what that reasonable number is, right? How many times am I allowed to repeat the same field selection with different arguments or with different aliases? Like, what's a reasonable number for that? Those are kind of things that we can put sensible limits on. And when there's an issue, we can say this specific point in your document breaks this rule. And you can then just fix it by like just removing a couple of lines and you're done. I think it's much easier for people to follow. It's not as protective. It's also not as like lenient. The cost directive, or the cost directive approach, is really smart because it can work out what the estimated cost of something is and then choose to allow it or not, which can allow you to do like a less deep but more complex query, or a deeper but less complex query kind of thing. Mark.
Yeah, when we calculate things like number of selection sets, a number of fields, is this expected to happen post or pre, like field merging? I'm assuming pre, because if it's on a document that the client writes, and so that might get quite annoying if you've composed a query of disparate fragments, and then the thing might complain at you've like repeated this too many times, but then it's, well, that's not my fault. I just own this fragment, and there's an owner of just that fragment, and like someone else on another team owns different fragments, and it all goes into the same query. And I'm wondering if we're talking about maybe like one solution here is we're talking about operation and query complexity, but well, fragment complexity. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's silly. I suppose fragment is a document as well, but yeah, I don't know. Another random thought there.
A fragment's a part of a document, yeah. And like
Yeah.
analyzing the complexity of an individual fragment, actually, that does tend to be the way that so I don't follow the IBM spec. I have my own one that I use because it's specifically for PostgreSQL. And for that one, I do figure out what the costs are in a fragment basis, and then I can compose that with the rest of the document in a really straightforward way without having to like basically revisit the fragment. So that does work well for me. But the question that you asked of like, is it pre or post field merging, I think is really, really important. And this is actually like, this would be a key thing that if we sent the script off with all the stuff that I'd been discussing before, and we hadn't answered that question before we sent it out, and then we realized afterwards, that would have been a major omission. And honestly, I probably would have fallen for it. Like, I know that it's significant, but I just wasn't thinking about it. So these is really important. And actually, what values should they be pre and what values should they be post is quite significant. The post field merging relates more to the execution complexity. So that's like, how many times are we actually going to call these resolvers? How many levels deep are we going to do this stuff at runtime? But the pre is actually relevant to validation complexity, because we do have issues or want to be able to prevent issues where just merely passing or validating the document is itself a potential vulnerability or a potentially expensive thing to do. And you can make GraphQL documents that take like 10 seconds to validate under GraphQL.js, even though they might only take a fraction of a second to execute. And this is like a really important thing there. So yeah, figuring those out is important. I was primarily thinking about pre-field merging, because I don't know, I was just going to look at the documents as they were and analyze them as they are. But doing a post one as well, I think, is actually really smart. Okay, that's lots of things to think about. If you have particular things that you have in your limits that you could share with me, like just drop a DM to me or something like that with details of the kind of things that you think are significant. The pre or post, I think, is a really, really important question. What to do with the results, really important. I really like Matt's point on essentially, like, can we make this a script that you can just run against your existing corpus to get what configuration variables you should use? I think that's a really neat idea as well. It makes it useful beyond just this data gathering. So that's really compelling. Are there some other key topics that folks would like to talk about today?
I didn't have anything in particular.
Are there any gaps that we should be specifically working on driving, pushing on a little bit?
I have a bunch that I care about that we've adopted at Yelp, and I think could be applicable to other folks, but I'm biased, so I'll remove myself from answering that question. I think all of them.
What out of them do you think should be in the default experience of people? Anyone who's adopting GraphQL today, like what should they have as the default experience that relates to these?
Well, by nature of being gaps, they're all kind of ancillary. So I don't know about like out the box experience, but the one that I'm finding the most value out of at the moment is the fully qualified operation names. I dislike using query names as a unique identifier because that's bad for reasons that we can dig into. And I also slightly dislike using operation IDs for humans because it's not very like human readable or informative. And I think the fully qualified operation name sort of provides a nice middle ground, and that's kind of what we're using for. That's what we're standardizing on for things like alerting config files, OTel spans. Anytime someone needs to like copy and paste something to look at an operation, like ownership information, it's all using these fully qualified operation names. So I think that's like a nice, yeah, I think it's a nice one.
Is this already published, the fully qualified operational?
Yep, it's GAP 7. I'll drop the link. Yeah.
I searched for GAP 7 on Google. I haven't found it yet. So we have to do a bit work on SEO on
Yeah,
Graph.
that's a good point. I haven't like looked at the meta tags, the OG meta tags. I should probably do that.
Question about gaps. So it's kind of not a gap, but
Well, it is a gap in the specification, but I think we can probably do better. In the composite schema specification, we have graphical federation specification. We have the lookups, which you just mentioned before, Matt, is also something which you or something like these lookups are interested in on the client or actually using on the client, and that the node pattern more or less is superseded by this. I think if after teaching 10 years that node is the way to go, we deviate, we should specify this and make this a thing. The question is a bit, how do we want to do this? Because we already have a lookup specification in the composite schema. We can see if this fits whatever is needed for clients. We've talked to Jordan before, and he mentioned that something like lookups would be very interesting for them as well. So
So I have two PRs open, gap 54 and 55, which we haven't merged. I don't know if I need to do an edit pass before merging or if we should just merge them basically as is, if it's enough. But like Jarell has commented on both of them. But yeah, so like I have a gap for how we do it at Meta. I would really like a like full federation lookup gap so we can kind of compare. And I think what we want for Golden Path is probably a subset of lookup. Because like, for instance, I think for Golden Path, it actually would be detrimental to allow multi-key lookups, even if that is like for the lookup in general, like yeah, my take is for Golden Path, we should be trying to distill out like you're really going to want this versus this is a neat thing that adds complexity that you may or may not need, and it's unclear that you really need it.
Why? So a lookup is just a pure function which returns an entity.
Mhm.
Why is it a problem if there's more than one possible key set to fetch the same entity?
So the problem is actually, it's not, the problem is in supporting it. Like it makes, if I'm in a non-federated situation,
Mhm.
why would we ever recommend somebody use multiple keys as opposed to just creating a resolver, a single resolver that is the key for looking things up? In a federated world, I understand why you might need to do like joins across.
I think so. I do see. Let's take GitHub. Let's say they have an internal ID for issues, so you can have issue by ID,
Mhm.
and you can have issue by, I don't know, whatever they call the fancy IDs that they have, where like one, let's say one would be an internal representation, the other one would be a the users, what the users see. Then you technically have a lookup for the same entity with two different keys, right? You have an external ID and you have an internal ID. And
Or yes,
prob-
this makes sense. I think maybe I'm misunderstanding. It's fine. I guess it's fine to have multiple fields that can be used to look things up.
right.
But having multiple keys for the same lookup, like having a root field that requires passing in 2 or 3 different keys,
I see.
that,
You can explore 3 different fields.
yeah.
Right. Okay, I understand now. So you're not worried about the fact that there's multiple lookups. You're more worried about the inputs into lookups. So the parameters of the function that we use. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So by you would say that a by field lookup probably is right. I see. I understand.
And because of that, I think it's been a while since I've looked at the lookup part of the spec. But I think another aspect of it is for Golden Path, we might not want to like have, oh yeah, lookup like automatically generates a root field for you. I don't know if it does, or if you specify what the root field is that you're using in the lookup. Basically, like we probably, and this is again why my argument is like we should have the full composite schema or federated schema, like lookup as a gap all on its own because it probably should stand alone and like isn't really federation specific. And then distill out like, okay, an identity and fetchability gap for Golden Path that gets us the best of like what strong and fetchable has and also what lookup has without people having to resort, like people falling back to node resolvers.
Yeah, I think this is it's a good base for a discussion, which we probably have to have at some point in the near future. I will also raise this in the Graphical Federation working group. Because if like in a perfect world, like there's one way to express identity and fetchability in graphical, period. Like I don't like we're now working towards a graphical federation specification, and a big part of entity or data federation is fetchability and identity. Like it's core to federation that you have keys and you have lookups. Now, it would hurt a bit if we already start off with two standards, if you know what I mean. So I think if it's possible to find a compromise where the exact same would work for both without having to overcomplicate it for either side, that would be really, really nice, because then we would essentially have I know, we can have multiple gaps for this essentially the same thing, but I think it would be beneficial for the ecosystem or for Graphical if we would land on, doesn't have to be like this, but if we find one way which works for everything, that would be fantastic. If not,
Yeah.
then we just have multiple gaps.
So I think for gaps, we should just bias towards action. Specifically, like, put the gap out, get the gap pulled in with its number, and then, like, my plan specifically is my plan with the strong and fetchable is actually to get those two deprecated as quickly as possible. I want them to be deprecated. However, there's a lot of, like, the Relay ecosystem. Like, if you look into the Relay open source Relay compiler, there's, like, special meta fields on the schema for strong and for fetchable that, like, I basically want to be able to point at this gap as, like, hey, this is why it exists. It's deprecated. It's not part of the golden path. You should not go down this path. But people have, which is why there's all this mess in like tooling and whatnot to support it.
I see.
Benji, before I go, I wanted to pick up on what Matt just said and take the conversation in a slightly different direction. But before I do that, if you have something more relevant to add, then I'll let you go first.
Okay, sure. I was just going to say that. So we've actually got two things here, right? One is getting an entity for any reason, and one of them is getting an entity because the code needs it, right? So Federation generally cares about getting an entity because the code needs it. Like, how do you talk across different services about the same record so you can get the relevant fields and merge them together? But the end user at the end of the day typically is going to want to actually be able to fetch something by multiple reasons. You might want to get a user by their username. You might want to get them because you know which organization they belong to and what their membership ID is, maybe by their email address. Maybe you're going to search for them by name, whatever. There's often many different ways of finding people. One of the main motivations for the one-of directive was not actually to solve, like, general input polymorphism, which is why it doesn't have a this or this or this or this format. It's why it allows you to specify string more than once with different labels. It was to solve problems like this, the idea of feeding an input into a field where you can say, I want a user by, and then you can specify which thing it's by, rather than having like 20 top level fields that is like user by email, user by username, user by organization ID and membership ID, because those get really, like, annoying over a while. You can definitely, like, nest them inside of things and you can, like, do things to restructure, but, like, it's really unpleasant, and the reusability is quite important. So I think that is important, and it should also play a part in this discussion. What we're actually exposing to the end users, ignoring the whole concept of federation or even just fetching records from, say, Relay when a fragment needs to be updated or when pagination occurs.
Well,
Back to you.
I think it's more about the concept of identity and the concept of fetching an entity, like a pure function. I don't think these are Relay or Federation specific. I think that one of the most powerful concepts I know in well, it's probably more than GraphQL because I don't know. Like REST has it as well, like the URI where you can actually fetch something forever with a unique identifier. And with Node, you can refetch or fetch an entity with just its ID, which is, yes, a canonical identity. This ID was really, really nice. Now, if we've seen that there's problems with it and so on. So having a fetchable and strong or lookup and key or whatever, like this will, I think, drive much, much more than federation and relay and so on. Like there's cache invalidation that you can do, caching that you can do with it, cache invalidation that you can drive with it. And like there's so many more use cases which we probably don't think about this now. So that's why I think it's so important that we land on a solution which is not specific to federation or clients or whatever. Because funnily enough, we support the node interface. We support the node resolver as a lookup because a lot of servers already have the node resolver. So when we have an ID, we can use it to look things up. So Fusion uses the node pattern as an easy way to do federation. So for us, it's really just a function that we need. And if we can get this specified, that would be generically specified, that would be really beneficial.
Go on, Mark, your turn.
Oh, okay. This was just like a super quick one minute put aside. Matt was mentioning that the relay compiler was special case handling the certain directives that you had for identity, and that might be quite painful to rip out. One of the things we discussed at a previous working group meeting, and I think before gaps was a thing and now the gaps was a thing, this would be easier, was just formalizing the difference between schemas that you write as a human and add in custom directives to versus schemas that a GraphQL server will actually sort of execute and then return you back it through introspection or whatever. And the idea of having like compilable directives that certain build chains will respect and sort of formalizing that just reminded me of that whole topic of conversation and how now it would be sort of slightly easier with gaps as a way to do that formal specification. And boy, it would be nice if we had that. So that's still at the back of my mind as something I want to like maybe pick up at some point in the future. Yeah, if anyone remembers that topic.
All right, folks. Well, thanks for chatting today. We're coming up to time. I think it sounds like we're going to be submitting a few different gaps and discussing a few different things. I have on my to-do list still to create this collection script. It's probably going to take me another month to get around to writing that. If anyone wants to take a punt at writing it beforehand, that would be really helpful. I think it's not going to be terribly complex. It's literally pass a document with GraphQL.js and then add a bunch of counters, add some kind of output formatting for it. Number of I don't know, actually. Yeah, figure out what a good output for that is. Maybe CSV, maybe just simple JSON files with like, here's queries, here's what their various stats were. it might actually be best if we do that kind of thing. That will then allow us to spot the percentiles more easily, but also potentially makes people less willing to run it because it will report on the actual number of documents it was run against, which may or may not be sensitive info. I don't know. Yeah, needs more exploration. But anyway, if anyone would like to take that on, please do. Otherwise, I'll be probably looking at it in about a month's time. Wish you all luck with drafting up your various gaps. Do keep the conversations going, and I'll look forward to talking to you in a month.
Thanks a bunch.
Bye.
Thanks all.